I've been using the iPhone 15 Pro Max for a few weeks now, and while it might look identical to its predecessor, this is no doubt the biggest Pro upgrade we have seen since the very first Pro iPhone, which released way back in 2019. There's of course the new A17 Pro CPU, RAM has increased from 6 to 8 gigs, there's a new action button which replaces the symbolic mute switch, a new USB 3.0 Type-C port which replaces the historic Lightning port, and a new camera setup which includes a periscope sensor for the first time in an iPhone. There's also a new material used to keep the phone together, that being titanium. It's lighter and stronger, but does pose some problems, which we'll get to a little later on in the video. In the box you'll find the device, a SIM ejector tool and an Apple sticker, as well as a braided USB 2.0 Type-C charging cable. And that's it. There's no charging block, so you'll have to pay extra for Apple's 20 or 30 watt charging brick, and there is of course no case either. However, today's sponsor Rhinoshield has sent me some incredible cases which we'll check out later on. This is TechNeck and this is my detailed review of Apple's most pro smartphone ever, the iPhone 15 Pro Max. The device is now widely available around the world with a starting price of $1199 for the base 256 gig variant, which is the exact same price as last year's 256 gig iPhone 14 Pro Max. It is worth mentioning though that Apple have scrapped the 128 gig model for the Pro Max, which is the only iPhone this year that doesn't have that option. In terms of design, it would be really hard to tell the difference between this year's new Pro Max and last year's when looking from a distance, except for those new colors of course. The camera module looks identical and the backplate does too. The largest design change is found when holding it, since its boxy side frames now roll into the back and front glass instead of squaring off, which not only makes it more comfortable to hold but gives it more grip too. However, the glass back is exactly the same as last year. It still has a matte finish and is still made by Corning. Once again, there is no ceramic shield protection on the back, which probably would have helped considering the back of the 15 Pro Max shatters rather easily based on the many drop tests which have gone quite viral as of late. But before your very expensive iPhone gets torn apart, it's rather important to choose a nice color, and there are 4 new ones to choose from. Just like most, I feel the natural titanium color which I have is the most unique and possibly the most nostalgic to look at if you are an iPhone fan. There's also blue, black and white titanium colors, and they all look very subtle, which in turn makes them look even more elegant. Of course, these colors spill into their side frames too, which are quite brushed this year and offer a nice soft feel thanks to them being made from grade 5 titanium. I won't lie though, this titanium feels rather similar to the non-pro aluminum iPhones. I'm going to miss those cold feeling stainless steel rails. What I won't miss are all the fingerprint smudges which are not quite as apparent on the new frame. What is more apparent however is its thickness, since it now comes in at 8.25mm thick, which is slightly noticeable when compared to last year's 7.85mm. That said, it is significantly lighter at 221 grams as opposed to its predecessor's 240 grams of weight. And that's no doubt thanks to ditching stainless steel in favor of titanium and aluminum. Yes, that's right, the inside chassis of the 15 Pro Max is made from recycled aluminum, which certainly doesn't help its build strength. The good news is that we still have the same great IP68 dust and water resistant certification, which means it can still survive 6 meters underwater for 30 minutes. As mentioned earlier, the back is still made from Corning glass, but I did notice it actually sounds less solid when you give it a knock. Thankfully, the display is still protected by ceramic shield glass, which is also developed by Corning. The iPhone 15 Pro Max still makes use of an always-on display as well as 3D Face ID, which is handy for unlocking your device and making payments. That 3D sensor is of course found within the pill-shaped notch at the top known as Dynamic Island, which is once again identical to last year's. The new model, however, has significantly smaller bezels wrapping around its screen, which makes for a slightly smaller size overall while still retaining the same sized screen. That being the exact same 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display, which has the same resolution with the same 460 pixels per inch, the same 120Hz ProMotion refresh rate, which uses the same LTPO technology to adjust between 1 and 120 Hz, and has the same peak brightness of 2000 nits. So if you were hoping for a massive display change this year, you're out of luck. aside from those razor thin bezels of course. In terms of software, I've been using iOS 17.0.2 for the most part while writing up this review, but 17.0.3 just released and addresses the heat issues which you've probably heard quite a lot about. Apple may have dropped the ball with its launch software, but it's good to see how quickly they have been pushing updates since launch. That said, most of iOS 17 is identical to iOS 16, especially in terms of appearance. However, they have added a few interesting new features, such as the new standby mode, which activates while charging but only works when in landscape mode. Widgets can now be stacked on top of one another, and certain widgets are even interactive. And the dynamic island, while still largely similar, now offers more interaction as well, such as long holding on the app displayed within the island to see that app in a floating pop-up for easier access. But that's not to say these features are exclusively for the latest iPhone 15 series, since most of these features are available for older iPhones which have just received iOS 17. And that dates quite far back, since most iPhones receive software support for up to 7 years. It is worth mentioning, however, that certain features such as dynamic island usability is only available on iPhones that actually have this pull-shaped notch. What is new, however, and exclusively for the new Pro iPhones, is the new sound toggle icon found within Control Center, and that's because they are the only two iPhones that include the new action button. The standard iPhone 15s stick to the same mute switch, which dates all the way back to the very first iPhone. By default, the action button works the same way as the mute switch, but instead of flicking the switch, you simply hold down the button to change sound profiles. That Control Center sound toggle comes in handy though if you do decide to jump into settings and allocate a different task to the action button, hence the name action button. You can set the action button to perform multiple different iOS tasks, and the most unique option is probably shortcuts, since you can set the button to do almost anything or open any app on your device. But for me, the most useful option is camera. You can choose which mode you want to open with the camera app when holding down the button, and once in the app you can even use the action button as a shutter button to take photos with. I just wish the button was placed in a more accessible location, such as the bottom right corner under the power button, which would not only make it easier to get to when using a Max iPhone, but more convenient placement for when using the button as a shutter button. I wonder how many times I just said the word button. Anyway, another exclusive for the new iPhone 15 series is its new charging port, which is now USB Type-C across the board. Bye-bye Lightning and hello universal compatibility. There are two catches with it, however. Firstly, only the Pro iPhone 15s have USB 3.0 speeds, while the standard iPhone 15s use USB 2.0. And secondly, the fancy braided cable, which comes included in the box, is a USB 2 cable, so you're gonna have to spend even more money to get faster transfers. But in all honesty, that's pretty common with most included smartphone cables. The new iPhone 15s now also have the ability to charge other devices such as AirPods, but it's capped at 4.5 watts and there's still no reverse wireless charging option. There is still of course wireless and MagSafe charging, but you would think with the new USB port, wired charging would now be faster. But the 15 Pro Max seems to peak at around 25 watts, which is actually less than last year's 14 Pro Max. I guess Apple is saving that one for the iPhone 16 series. These USB ports also double up as display ports and can output 4K video to an external monitor or TV, which is a big step up from previous iPhone's Full HD resolution output when using a Lightning adapter. This means that you can play 4K video content in a 16:9 aspect ratio within the Photos app and certain video streaming apps such as Netflix, but unfortunately other third-party apps such as YouTube have black bars all around the video. At least you can eliminate the sidebars once you zoom into the video, but I'm assuming devs will start updating apps to adhere to this full screen requirement. Another big advantage of this is that you can hook up an external controller to your iPhone via Bluetooth and play games such as Call of Duty Mobile on an external display. There's still bars above and below the game, which again hopefully gets addressed soon, but it certainly gives you that console feel, especially since the only noticeable lag is between the iPhone and the controller. This of course leads us to Apple's new A17 Pro chipset, which now includes GPU hardware accelerated ray tracing instead of the usual software-based tracing. This opens up a whole new world in terms of console gaming on an iPhone, which is exactly what Apple are doing. They will soon be releasing fully fledged console games such as Resident Evil Village and Assassin's Creed Mirage. They will of course be ported, so at the end of the day it comes down to game developers on whether or not they will make other AAA games available on iPhones. But you have to admit, it. That's pretty darn cool, especially if you can hook up these games to an external monitor and use a controller. Apple's like, hey PlayStation, hold my beer. And to keep you powering through is a 4441 mAh battery, which is slightly larger than last year's 4323 mAh cell. This extra juice, paired alongside Apple's new A17 Pro CPU, should make this the most efficient iPhone Pro Max to date, especially considering that it is the first smartphone chipset in the world to be using TSMC's new 3nm process node. Apple's latest chipset is still stacked with 6 cores that consists of 4 efficiency cores and 2 performance cores with a whopping max core clock speed of 3.78 GHz. That's 10% faster than the A16 Bionic. There's also now a 6-core GPU up from last year's 5 cores, which Apple have stated is now 20% faster. They have also now finally bumped up RAM to 8 gigs in the Pro models, and they are using Micron's new ultra-dense D1B LPDDR5 DRAM chips. When pairing all this together, along with Apple's impressive NVMe storage, I was more than pleased with how the 15 Pro Max performed in multiple different benchmark tests. AnTuTu scores are finally on par with Qualcomm chips, Geekbench scores are significantly better than other flagship chipsets around, but only slightly better than last year's A16 Bionic, and while GPU scores within 3D Mark are impressive, it still trails behind other branded chips. All these scores translate to impeccable gaming performance, and within a game such as Call of Duty Mobile, we were able to toggle on 120 FPS mode within the game's settings, which most Androids seem to cap at 90 or even 60 FPS. I really wanted to test out the average FPS while playing, but since services such as Geekbench and PerfDog don't yet support iOS 17 devices, we're going to have to wait to get a deeper analysis of performance. But from my experience, the game felt extremely smooth thanks to that 120Hz refresh rate. Another game that's capped at 60 FPS on Androids but can be set to a staggering 120 FPS on iPhones is Genshin Impact. This game is extremely power hungry, so I wouldn't expect it to actually hit 120 frames per second on maxed out graphical settings, but the fact that we have it as an option is definitely a huge iPhone incentive. The 15 Pro Max once again felt extremely consistent while playing with barely any frame drops, and though it did get a bit hotter than I was expecting, it still felt cooler than most Androids I've tested out. I'll soon be comparing the latest iPhone to other flagships in terms of gaming benchmarks, battery and heat dissipation in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for some more detailed measurements coming soon. The iPhone 15 Pro Max still makes use of Bluetooth 5.3, NFC and 5G, while Wi-Fi has now improved with Wi-Fi 6E. The Taptic engine is here to stay and feels fantastic, not to mention we do still have the same great sounding hybrid stereo speaker system which makes use of Dolby Atmos automatically, so let's go ahead and give them a listen. So now all that's left is to test out those cameras. But taking photos and videos can be quite challenging at times, which can often lead to shattering drops, which is why today's sponsor Rhinoshield have sent me some of the most protective cases on the market. All cases have an 11-foot drop protection, come in loads of colors which you can mix and match using different camera rings and buttons, and you can even design your own case with custom images. They have plenty room around their charging ports, and all cases can be bought with or without MagSafe, which is now twice as strong as Apple's official MagSafe products. The solid suitcase has rounded edges and a slightly curved back for more grip. There are plenty different backplate options for the Mod NX case, and it can be used with or without the included backplate. This means you have the option to use it as a bumper case for those who want to feel the rear back glass of the iPhone. But my favorite has to be their new clear case, which does not discolor and even comes with a lifetime warranty against yellowing. It's also now 23% thinner while retaining the same protection. And if you would like 360 degrees of protection, Rhinoshield also offer a few different screen protectors which come bundled with a frame to make installation easier. I'll leave links in the description as well as a 10% discount code which applies to all items on their site, not just iPhone 15 accessories. Now that we're good in terms of protection, it's finally time to focus up on those cameras. So let's kickstart things off with selfie camera performance. It still has that fairly large pill-shaped cutout at the top center of its display, which houses an identical selfie camera to the one seen on the 14 Pro Max, that being a 1 in 3.6 inch sized 12 megapixel sensor with a 23mm focal length, f1.9 aperture, PDAF and unconfirmed optical image stabilization. Alongside the selfie camera is the same 3D ToF sensor, which is of course used for biometrics, but also doubles up as a depth sensor for portraits, which can now capture depth information without actually being in portrait mode. That's quite nifty if you would like to add depth later on after you take the shot. Wide-angled selfies output at native 12 megapixel resolution, and as you would expect, they come out perfect. Taking selfies at 1x crops bins down to 7.15 megapixels, but look just as good, and as always, edge detection is insanely good in portrait mode thanks to that 3D ToF sensor. But unfortunately, there is no way of taking wide-angled portraits at 12 megapixels. Even though many would prefer close-up selfies, I like the flexibility of the wider focal length, so I'm happy to see that selfie videos use this wider field of view.
There's no focal length options which you can choose from, so it reverts to the ultra-wide every time. There's no crop-in factor at all. But when it comes to selfie video on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, unlike most Android devices, we can actually record selfie video at crispy clear 4K resolution and silky smooth 60 frames per second. We can also record at 4K resolution when in cinematic mode using the selfie camera. Yes, you heard that right, 4K. Most phones can only record bokeh video at full HD resolution. This time we get 4K and 30 frames per second, which is the max when recording with the selfie cam in cinematic mode.
Cinematic selfie video comes out quite grainy at night, even when set to 24 FPS, and while it doesn't really add any depth, it's fairly bright. Regular selfie video, on the other hand, comes out okay at night. It's now dimmer and suffers from even more noise grain. Wide selfie photos at night come out very bright with night mode enabled, but drop the ball in terms of detail. And the same can be said for cropped in selfies at night. Portrait mode has no night mode option, so it lacks brightness and detail, and while the flash certainly brightens things up, the quality is still very subpar. As with all iPhones before it, the 15 Pro Max takes some of the best selfie photos and videos during the day, but as per usual, it misses the mark in terms of night selfie performance. That said, its rear cameras perform incredibly well in all lighting conditions, so let's get into it. It has a triple camera setup on its back, which consists of an ultra-wide, a main, and a telephoto sensor. But that telephoto sensor, for the first time on an iPhone, is now actually a tetra prism designed 1 in 3.06 inch sized 12 megapixel periscope lens. It has a focal length of 120mm, which can reach 5 times optical zoom. It has a very bright f2.8 aperture and packs in dual pixel PDAF as well as 3D sensor shift OIS. The 1 in 2.55 inch sized 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera is however exactly the same as last year, with an aperture of f2.2 and a focal length of 13mm for a 120 degree field of view. The LiDAR sensor is the same too, which just like we saw with selfies also captures depth information without needing to be in portrait mode. And lastly, we have the 1 in 1.28 inch sized 48 megapixel main sensor, which has an aperture of f1.78 and supports dual pixel PDAF as well as second generation sensor shift OIS. It may seem identical on paper when compared to last year's main sensor, but it now outputs 24 megapixel images instead of 12 megapixels by default. It also still has the same 24mm focal length, but this time when you tap on the 1x button within the camera UI, you can shift between 24mm, 28mm or 35mm focal lengths for a 1x, 1.2x or 1.5x crop in. It's nice and convenient for those who prefer tapping instead of sliding on the zoom wheel, but at the end of the day, they are still just digital crops of the main 24 megapixel output. And this is evident when enabling the JPEG Max setting for full resolution photos. At 1x, we get a 48 megapixel shot, while at 1.2x, 35 megapixels, and 1.5x, 24 megapixels. But the best thing about the new main camera is its ability to shoot at native 48 megapixels, bin down 24 megapixels, or further bin down 12 megapixels. We'll be sticking to the default 24 megapixel mode from now on, but it's worth mentioning that sometimes it automatically reverts to 12 megapixel shots depending on the camera mode being used. Macro mode automatically kicks in and shifts to the ultra-wide sensor when you get close enough to a subject, and my word, does it look good. These are fake flowers, by the way. Taking a standard ultra-wide shot looks stunning and offers great edge distortion prevention, but the star of the show has to be the 24 megapixel output main camera, which offers perfect balance in terms of exposure and detail. 2x lossless zoom using the main camera is fairly consistent and packs in plenty detail, but this is where the main camera automatically adjusts further down to 12 megapixels. 3x digital zoom using the main becomes a tad more grainy and is far from perfect. This is where the 14 Pro Max kicked in its telephoto sensor for a much cleaner shot. The 15 Pro Max switches to its periscope telephoto sensor at 5x, and thanks to this being its optical zoom level, things look absolutely perfect. I wonder if Apple will manage to fit 2 zoom lenses into the iPhone 16 Pro Max, just like we see within many Android phones these days. Things still look fantastic at a 10x zoom range thanks to the use of so-called lossless zoom. 15x digital zoom is a tad more grainy, and this was the max zoom of the 14 Pro Max. The 15 Pro Max, on the other hand, can reach a max digital zoom of 25x, which is the furthest zoom we have ever seen on an iPhone. Using the periscope camera to take a 5x optically zoomed shot in portrait mode looks unreal. But as you would expect, you have to stand pretty far away to get this shot. 2x lossless zoom using the main camera in portrait mode looks almost as good and is a lot easier to use, while 1x portrait mode provides great depth and is probably the most used focal length in portrait mode. But if you would like the most amount of subject detail with decent natural blur, then full-blown 48 megapixel resolution is probably the way to go. Recording 4K ProRes video using the main camera looks breathtaking with a fair amount of natural depth, and this year you can shoot ProRes at 4K 60fps with external recording. Regular 4K 60fps video recording looks great too and offers a nice subtle background blur. But again, there is no 8K video recording option on iPhones, even though the Pro Max is more than capable of doing so. Cinematic video goes all the way up to 4K resolution, but is still capped at 30fps. Detail is superb and edge detection is incredible. Cinematic video can also be recorded at a 2x zoom range using the main camera, and while detail is still decent, edge detection takes a bit of a back seat. There is no cinematic mode option for the periscope camera, but it can still record 4K 60fps video with phenomenal natural blur and even more impressive detail. You can also record 240fps slow motion video at full HD resolution using the periscope, which you can of course also do with the main camera, which comes out more than decently, as well as with the ultra-wide sensor, though I'm not quite sure I'd ever record slow-mo at such a high field of view. The ultra-wide camera can also shoot regular 4K video at up to 60fps and is probably the best looking ultra-wide video you will find on a smartphone. Not to mention its stabilization is out of this world. Stabilization is even better when using the action mode to record 2.8K ultra-wide video at 60fps, which I used here while running fairly fast. The main camera also offers action mode at the same resolution and frame rate, but it's worth mentioning that both cameras crop in quite a bit when using this feature. Regular 4K 60fps video using the main comes out incredibly good, especially in terms of stability, and is probably the best 4K video you will see come out of any smartphone in 2023. Dropping the frame rate to 24fps seems to be the sweet spot for night videography, since it brightens things up by a good amount and reduces noise grain. But even with 24fps enabled while using the ultra-wide camera, things don't come out quite as good, and noise grain is certainly an issue, which is even more evident when recording a subject at night using that ultra-wide sensor. Main 4K video of a subject comes out a lot better at night when compared to the ultra-wide, but detail is still lacking, and while blur is more evident when using cinematic mode at night, bad lens flare is still quite noticeable. The lens flare particles are even worse when using cinematic mode at a 2x zoom level, and while lens flare is slightly reduced when recording regular video with the periscope, noise grain is a tad more apparent. Taking a portrait photo at night using the periscope comes out substantially better, and arguably better than when using the main camera at a 2x zoom level. Using the main at 1x looks a lot better when taking a portrait shot at night, but taking a regular photo with night mode enabled looks quite a bit better in terms of detail. That said, 24 megapixel mode without night mode comes out the best. Using night mode with the ultra-wide camera has things come out very bright, but in turn takes a dip in detail. And while things aren't quite as bright when using the main camera without night mode enabled, things come out looking very natural and packed with detail. Aside from those lens flare particles, of course. Enabling night mode drops the main camera to 12 megapixel resolution. It certainly looks brighter, but natural detail takes a knock and lens flare is more noticeable. 2x digital zoom comes out looking better than 1x, which is very strange, but detail starts to fade at 3x digital zoom when using the main camera. Things are cleaned up very nicely when that periscope sensor kicks in for 5x optical zoom, and 10x lossless zoom came out looking a lot better than I was expecting. The same goes for 15x digital zoom, which continues to handle light noise very well, and while the max digital zoom, that being 25x, isn't quite as good as 15x, it still looks a lot better at night when compared to other smartphones at the zoom range. The iPhone 15 Pro Max might not take the best smartphone photos and videos on the planet, but it certainly produces the best results I have ever seen come from an iPhone, especially in terms of consistency. That new periscope sensor alone may be enough to sway most people into upgrading. The new action button, USB Type-C port, slimmer bezels, and beefier chipset are very tempting too, but if you're coming from a 14 Pro Max, I don't think it's enough to justify an upgrade just yet. Unless you get a very good offer on your older iPhone. If you do decide to pull the trigger, however, I can't really blame you. After all, this is Apple's most pro iPhone to date. Whether you upgrade or not, don't forget to check out the description for Rhinoshield's link and discount code, which can be used for many different Apple products, including Apple Watches and AirPods, as well as many other popular smartphone brands. This is TechNick, and I'll catch you in the next one.